Thank you, Mr President. And I would also extend my welcome to our visitors from Samoa. It's wonderful to have you here. Madam Deputy President, I bring a motion for debate today in my name which reads that the Legislative Council, 1, recognises that the regular publication of the members of Cabinet's official diaries provides an important accountability mechanism by improving transparency and strengthening public confidence in government decision-making processes. 2, notes that the regular and mandated disclosure of official ministerial diaries detailing meetings with stakeholders, third parties and registered lobbyists is established practice across a range of parliaments including New South Wales, ACT and Queensland. And 3, requests the Tasmanian Government undertakes to introduce mandated requirements for the regular and routine disclosure of all Ministerial and Cabinet Secretary official diaries, detailing scheduled meetings and their purpose with stakeholders and organisations, including third parties and lobbyists, and when developing this disclosure regime to also A, ensure the process is informed by best practice examples of mandatory disclosure of ministerial diary requirements established in other jurisdictions, including examples of oversight and compliance requirements, and B, develop and publicly consult on a proposed Tasmanian mandatory disclosure of ministerial diary scheme. Madam Deputy President, I will begin in my contribution with the final clause of the motion, which is clause 3 with its 2 subclauses A and B. I wish to start at the end, as it were, as it's important to emphasise what this motion is not seeking to do. Crucially, this motion does not seek to impose or lock in any particular model or regime of ministerial diary disclosure, nor does it seek to impose a specified implementation timeframe. Instead, this motion requests that the state government makes a commitment to introduce this integrity transparency measure of mandated regular disclosure of ministerial diaries. And further, that when the model is under development, the government undertakes to publicly consult any proposed model and to ensure it's informed by the established and proven best practice models in other national and international examples. Madam Deputy President, if there is a silver lining to Tasmania potentially dragging its feet in developing a comprehensive, rigorous and modern integrity framework for the state, it is that there can be no excuse for any developments in this area not to be evidence-based due to the already implemented examples available interstate, which I'll mention briefly later in my contribution. So to reiterate, this motion is not asking the Chamber here and now to impose any particular ministerial diary disclosure scheme upon the government, but it does invite the government in turn to invite the community and other governance experts and stakeholders to have a say in developing such a modern component of our integrity, transparency and accountability apparatus. Returning then to clause 1 of the motion, Madam Deputy President, this outlines in broad brushstrokes the why of this proposal, which I'll now speak to in some further detail. At the outset, let's place the proposed ministerial diary disclosure reform within the broader lobbying and lobbyists regulation context. Lobbying in and of itself is not a bad thing. Indeed, I'm very aware there can be a fine line between lobbying and advocacy. Lobbying can make a valid contribution to the political decision-making and policy formation process. It can bring valuable insights and practical knowledge to the discussion table. However, it can, and does, become problematic when those that get a seat at the table are disproportionately representing certain sectors and get to do so often and in a vacuum devoid potentially of countervailing perspectives. As members here would be aware, the Tasmanian Integrity Commission is currently reviewing our lobbying regulatory mechanisms, which at the moment consists of the Lobbyist Register and Code of Conduct. In its 2022 submission to that process, the Grattan Institute reiterates the following. Lobbying is an important part of the democratic contest of ideas, but this contest takes place on an uneven playing field if money and relationships can make a big difference to access and influence. Transparency around lobbying activity helps encourage a more level playing field. And that report from the Grattan Institute goes on to further state, lobbying oversight should aim to promote transparency of lobbying activity and accountability of public officials. Broader transparency measures give countervailing voices an opportunity to speak up and encourage policymakers to seek out a wider range of views. This can only be a good thing, Madam Deputy President. Encouraging a policy and decision-making process that incorporates a wider range of views is not only more representative and fairer, it is just good and sensible practice. I'm sure it's occurring in many offices and departments, but what this motion calls for is a process by which the Tasmanian people can check regularly that it is occurring, and that if there are instances where the involvement and representation of certain vested interests appears to be out of balance with community and other interests, we are then in a position to be able to ask why. Madam Deputy President, to return to the Grattan Institute, I also wish to highlight the following statement of the Institute's submission, which goes specifically to the disclosure of ministerial diaries. It says this: Ministerial officers should publish details of all official meetings, both in the office and off-site, all scheduled phone calls and all events attended by a minister in an official capacity. Official meetings should include those at which a minister was present, as well as those held with ministerial advisers only. Records of meetings should identify those present and key issues discussed. To be useful, ministerial diaries must be published in a timely manner and an accessible form. For example, all meetings for 1 month could be published by the end of the following month, as already happens in Queensland. The publication should be searchable and exportable to facilitate scrutiny. Madam Deputy President, that was the Grattan Institute's view, and there were a range of submissions made to the Integrity Commission's lobbying review consultation process, of which many presented strong and considered cases for also, beyond what was being covered by the Integrity Commission, the inclusion of a mandated ministerial or other government representative diary disclosure regime. Some of those who made such representations included TASCOS and the Centre for Public Integrity, and I would disclose that I also included that in the submission I made to that process. However, I don't intend to take up members' time now by recounting all those relevant contributions, but I would certainly urge people with an interest to take a look at those submissions, as they're informative and insightful across a range of integrity matters. Instead, though, I do wish to focus on key themes relevant to this motion, which was shared across many of the submissions also, around transparency and inclusion on a level playing field. Those are the themes which consistently appear across most reviews, proposals and evaluations undertaken by those with governance expertise. Madam Deputy President, we would all be familiar with the expression of the disinfectant of sunlight, or some variation of that concept. It may be of interest to members to know that this concept first appears in 1913 and is attributed to US lawyer Louis Brandeis. His assertion that, and I quote, "Sunlight is said to be the best of disinfectants." It was published that year in a Harper's Weekly article called "What Publicity Can Do." He also explicitly wrote this: "If the broad light of day could be let in upon men's actions, it would purify them as the sun disinfects." So basically, Madam Deputy President, Brandeis is tapping into the idea that it is human nature for people to change their behaviour, usually for the better, if they know they're being observed. Further, we may resist behaving in a manner that does not meet expected standards if we think that behaviour will attract attention or become a topic of discussion. And while this may be perceived by some as a somewhat cynical attitude towards our fellow citizens, the fact remains that this phrase, coined over 100 years ago, still resonates, it still strikes a chord with us. The other phrases we often hear in discussion on transparency include things like secret deals and behind closed doors, mates rates and those sorts of concepts. They're all colloquial examples of a similar framing of concerns over nepotism or secrecy, or the public interest getting lost or superseded by private vested interests. And the solution, Madam Deputy President, it's pretty simple. In the first instance, unlock the doors, open the curtains, raise the blinds. Madam Deputy President, transparency, or the lack of it, is also linked with the other theme I wish to mention briefly, and that is access to and inclusion on a level playing field. Without consistent transparency, it's tricky to ascertain whether those who wish to take up their democratic right of seeking access to their government representatives or other senior officials are able to do so equitably, and that their requests are treated equitably. We all here know how busy elected representatives can be, whether they are in government, in cabinet, or even just a garden variety MP or MLC. It can be a challenge to find time to fit in all the meeting requests for many valid reasons. However, it's during those high-pressure, tight time frame scenarios that the decision-making and the filtering process of who is prioritised for access is so crucial. And I'm sure we'd all like to think that all relevant stakeholders and perspectives are prioritised as equally as possible during policy development decision-making, to the extent that government officials actively seek out perspectives which may not have been represented in those who proactively put themselves forward seeking meetings. One submitter, in fact, to the Integrity Commission's Lobbying Regulatory Review, Dr Belinda Edwards of the University of New South Wales, made a very interesting and useful point on the need to make visible the balance or potentially imbalance of accessibility to decision makers. Dr Edwards states this in her submission, and I quote, "In terms of how you make visible what the disparities of access are and generate incentives to address imbalances, there are insights to be drawn from attempts to improve equity in other areas, such as in addressing gender and racial equity. Work on gender equity has found one of the most effective ways to improve gender equity in organisations is to record and report what the level of equity is and then have leaders have to announce it publicly, preferably in person. The focus on the issue and the desire to meet social expectations of equity, particularly in public, is an effective motivator to correct inequities." I think that's a very useful correlation, Madam Deputy President, for us to consider. Effectively, transparency leads to accountability, leads to gaps being identified if they're there, whether deliberate or unintended, and provides an impetus to do something to fill those gaps. Madam Deputy President, I want to briefly focus on another important point made by the Grattan Institute in the submission I quoted earlier. And to reiterate, it said this: "To be useful, ministerial diaries must be published in a timely manner and an accessible form." And the emphasis here that I'm pointing to is on timely. This is an essential ingredient in order to effectively provide public trust and confidence in the decision-making processes on policy matters of the day, particularly major policy, which requires potentially Parliament's deliberations. As an example, the importance of timely disclosure became very evident to me last year when preparing for debate on the long-awaited and significant climate change state action bill. In the absence that we currently have of regularly published ministerial diaries, when preparing for that bill to be debated last year, I submitted in July 2022 a right to information request for dates, locations and attendee details of all ministerial diary appointments held since the 19th of May 2021 that were for the purpose of discussing climate change policy, including but not limited to the two bills that were to be debated in this chamber. The request that I put in, the RTI request, specified meetings with stakeholders, including but not limited to registered lobbyists, and one or more non-industry or community stakeholders. The request covered the ministerial offices of those holding the climate change portfolio, energy and renewables and resources, as well as the Premier and Treasurer. The acceptance of those RTI requests that I gained illustrates that in this context, clearly the release of ministerial diaries passed the public interest test. But then obtaining that information deemed to be in the public interest was a different matter. As I flagged earlier, I submitted this RTI request in July last year. As members may recall, the climate change bill was debated in the other place during August and September and received its first reading in this chamber on the 7th of September. We got to the third reading, the debate and the third reading in November, with the third reading being the 9th of November. And in terms of a timeline, I did receive some of those RTI requests and those responses in September, prior to the debate in this chamber. But it wasn't until the 31st of January 2023 that I received the ministerial diary RTI responses from at least one of those portfolio officers I mentioned earlier. 6 months after the request was made, I finally received the requested information. But more crucially, the information arrived 3 to 4 months after it would have been pertinent to the public debate and the parliamentary debate underway in this place. And that's where the problem arises. That's not really good enough, that delay. It undermines the ethos of our RTI Act. It also undermines our responsibility potentially in this place to be as fully informed as possible on matters before us for our consideration in the Parliament. This is where a mandated regular release of ministerial diaries would save time and effort, take pressure off our RTI regime and ensure a more timely availability of relevant information to the public and to decision makers even in this place. It all comes down to the shared expectation that in a functioning democracy, people deserve to have all pertinent information available to ensure they can make an informed decision at the time they're required to make that decision. That's a principle that would apply, for example, to voters knowing about political donations before they cast their ballot at the ballot box, or even to this Parliament, to have information available before we're debating legislation that might be of relevance. Madam Deputy President, I'll now move on to discussing the points raised in Clause 2 of the motion, specifically focusing on ministerial diary disclosure models that have been implemented elsewhere. I had earlier circulated a short background briefing paper to members which includes some information on those interstate models already implemented, and I mentioned just some brief details of those here. First is in the ACT. Since 2018, the ACT has required agencies and ministers to comply with the Open Access Information Scheme, OAIS, provided for under the Territory's FOI Act. The OAIS is designed to increase government accountability and promote a culture of openness and transparency in government. This push model for access to information intends to reduce formal requests for access to some government information and enables the ACT community to access government information promptly at the lowest reasonable cost. Along with other disclosure logs, the ACT and ACT minister must disclose and publish a copy of the minister's diary that sets out all meetings, events and functions attended by the minister that relate to the minister's responsibilities. Personal events or meetings need not be included, and ministerial diaries in the ACT are currently published as required on the ACT Government Open Access website. And then, of course, there's New South Wales, and there it's been in place a little longer. On the 13th of May 2014, the New South Wales Liberal Premier, Michael Baird at the time, announced a package of reforms to strengthen the regulation of lobbying activities and to ensure that contact between lobbyists and government officials is conducted in accordance with public expectations of transparency, integrity and honesty. The package of reforms included the requirement that ministers publish quarterly diary summaries of scheduled meetings with external organisations on portfolio-related activities. A year following the introduction of mandated ministerial diary disclosure, a 12-month review was undertaken by the Department of Premier and Cabinet, which recommended a range of improvements, such as inclusion of third-party lobbyists and the expansion of meetings to include phone calls, amongst other recommendations. A Premier's memorandum sets out the requirement for all ministers to regularly publish extracts from their diaries detailing scheduled meetings held with stakeholders, external organisations, third-party lobbyists and the name of their client and individuals. Scheduled meetings include meetings scheduled to take place in person or by video conference, teleconference or telephone call. Ministerial diary excerpts in New South Wales are published 1 month after the end of each quarter and include details of all scheduled meetings of a minister involving the discussion of a matter that may be considered by the minister, whether formally or informally, in his or her role as portfolio minister or a member of cabinet. A range of matters are exempt, including meetings that are strictly personal, electorate or party political matters, social or public functions or events, and matters for which there is no overriding public interest against disclosure. Ministerial disclosures are published in New South Wales on the Department of Premier and Cabinet website.
Just while you're having a little sip of water, I might recognise and acknowledge the Year 6 students, or some of them, I think there's more to come, from the Friends School in Hobart. We welcome you to the chamber. At the moment, Tuesday's a private members' day in our Legislative Council, which means that members who aren't the government, any of us, can put forward motions for debate, and the member for Nelson is currently putting the case to support the publication and disclosure of ministerial diaries, so it's more easy for members of the public to see who the ministers have been meeting with and perhaps lobbying them for on matters that are really important to the state. So after the member for Nelson's finished, other members will have a chance to speak, as will the Deputy Leader for the government today. Our leader's actually unfortunately away this week, and she'll respond on behalf of the government. Thanks, Member for Nelson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Chair, and welcome to the students. Thank you. And the third jurisdiction I will briefly mention, just as an example here, Madam Deputy President, is Queensland. The Queensland Government's Ministerial Handbook details the following requirements surrounding ministerial diaries: that ministers are required to proactively disclose on a monthly basis portfolio-related meetings and events. For any meeting with a registered lobbyist or a person working for the lobbyist in any capacity other than administrative staff, the diary must also include details about all attendees and a short description of the subject matter of the meeting. Personal, electorate or party political meetings or events, media events and interviews and information contrary to public interest, for example, meetings regarding sensitive law enforcement, public safety or whistleblower matters, are not to be released. Ministers' diaries are public records under the Public Records Act 2002, and as such should be retained and managed in accordance with the retention and disposal schedule in the relevant section of their handbook. Additionally, and this is a very interesting additional element for consideration, the Queensland Opposition Leader also releases extracts from their official diary. In accordance with guidelines for the Office of the Leader of the Opposition, monthly extracts from the diary of the Leader of the Opposition are published on the Queensland Parliament's website, where records are currently available going back to January 2013. So, Madam Deputy President, that's a fairly quick and rudimentary highlights reel of some of our fellow national jurisdictions' innovations in allowing sunlight into the ministerial room, and they depict that there is a range of approaches and mechanisms that could be put in place. We may or may not agree with each of these models. There may be elements some think do not go far enough to invest in a level playing field or timely transparency, while there may be other characteristics of these models that people may consider unnecessary. However, despite their individual differences, all those jurisdictions mentioned, and many others to boot, have ministerial diary disclosure regimes. They share the fundamental principle and commitment to the fact that citizens deserve to know who is in the ministerial room, when and for what purpose. It's interesting to note that across these three jurisdictions, Labor, Liberal, National and Greens ministers have all complied with these transparency measures. Madam Deputy President, members here may be surprised to know that ministerial diary disclosure is not a radically new or unheard of concept even for Tasmania. In fact, we have a relatively recent example close to home. It may interest members to know that a little over 12 years ago, the former Labor Premier, David Bartlett, did, of his own volition, begin disclosing his ministerial diary publicly. This decision seemed to follow a successful Freedom of Information, as it was called then, request in 2009. As I understand it, once the Freedom of Information request was accepted as in the public interest and the requested 4 months of diary information provided, Premier Bartlett then chose to continue releasing his ministerial diary as a matter of routine throughout 2010. This aligned well with the broad push from then Premier Bartlett to implement, I believe, a 10-point plan to restore trust in government. It was an effort which included the overhaul of the RTI legislation, the creation of the Integrity Commission, the Public Interest Disclosure Act, and the creation of a Ministerial Code of Conduct. And however else we might assess elements of Premier Bartlett's time in office, without a doubt, he significantly strengthened the architecture of integrity and democracy in this state. And on the matter of publishing his ministerial diaries, unfortunately, the practice was never incorporated into the Ministerial Code of Conduct. So it stalled and was discontinued, it would appear, by the government, presumably once Mr Bartlett had resigned from office. So the Bartlett diaries, Madam Deputy President, provide a good example on 2 points. One, it has and can occur in Tasmania without the sky falling in. And two, for it to genuinely result in meaningful cultural change, it needs to be mandated as a formal requirement. An opt-in, opt-out, dependent on who is in power type of model is quite frankly ineffectual and not really an option that we would consider appropriate, I wouldn't think, going forward. Madam Deputy President, before I sum up, there are a couple of other just key points I want to make relating to the motion. The first one is around the idea that transparency actually provides protection. Other than the common sense and fairness inherent in disclosing those who have access to our government representatives, this transparency reform of disclosure of ministerial diaries can also assist participants in meetings by diffusing the perception or the risk of possible undue influence being wielded. Lifting of the blinds and the injection of sunlight into the room can reassure people that nothing shady is going on. Improved transparency is about reducing the perception of and any actual unfair advantage that may influence government decision-making processes to benefit a few. It would be a fair assumption that governments and ministers of all persuasions and senior departmental officials would probably welcome this assistance. Another point I'd like to touch on, Madam Deputy President, is that the routine and rigorous and timely ministerial disclosure process would also alleviate pressure on our right to information processes. I can imagine the size of relief that may be uttered by many RTI officers in departments who would be freed up to focus on other pending RTI requests if matters related to diaries was taken out of the mix. We have precedents acknowledging the public interest and the right to this information being provided through our RTI system, and currently we insert an unnecessary middle person in that process, what we know is overburdened RTI processes. As other jurisdictions have, we could remove this middle person mechanism between the government of the day and the community that they have been elected to represent by the introduction of a standard, mandated, systematic ministerial diary disclosure scheme. Madam Deputy President, it's worth briefly touching on the standard reaction which we often hear when proposals are put forward to strengthen our integrity and transparency apparatus. And that's something I have heard before, and it goes along these lines. There's no proof of any wrongdoing occurring. There's no proof that we've got systemic corruption in this state. We don't need to take action to improve our performance. And Madam Deputy President, I'm hoping that in today's debate that sort of sentiment won't bog us down or derail the discussion. I think it's a fairly spurious point to make. We may not have flagrant recent examples of documented instances of corruption or serious criminal behaviour in our governance, but there is an ongoing decline in trust and confidence in, and a growing frustration with, our systems of governance in this state. And a large part of that declining confidence and growing frustration is with the opaque cloud under which key policy and funding decisions remain swaddled. And the perception persists, rightly or wrongly, that behind that opaque cloud, decisions can be made, and perhaps are made, based on personal networks and who you know. To put it bluntly, any cry of "there's nothing to see here" simply will not wash as an acceptable standard. There most definitely is something to see here. Tasmanians deserve to see who is in the ministerial room when policy and funding decisions, grant provisions, contract arrangements are being discussed. And of course, this potentially provides insight into any stakeholders who perhaps did not have access or did not participate in those decisions. Parliamentarians deserve to see this too, and in fact it's arguable we have a responsibility to ensure that we do see who was or wasn't in the ministerial room seeking to influence policy decisions, the outcome of which may be placed before us to vote on in this place. And just lastly, on the nothing to see here attitude, disclosure is the simplest manner by which to corroborate there really isn't anything untoward to be seen. As we get told in other contexts, if you have nothing to hide, then you shouldn't have a problem here. That appears to be what was demonstrated by former Labor Premier Bartlett's approach when he set a precedent for Tasmania by choosing to release his ministerial diary.
So I'm just taking a small break there. I might just welcome our second group of grade 6 students from Friends School in Hobart. We hope you enjoy your time here. Tuesdays are private members' days in the Legislative Council, where members who aren't members of the government can put forward motions. We call them for debate, ideas, things that we want to talk about. And that's what the member for Nelson is doing. She's put forward a motion about the release of ministerial diaries to see who the ministers have been meeting with in their formal capacity. So when the member for Nelson finishes, other members will have a chance to speak, and the Deputy Leader of the Government in the front seat here will respond on behalf of the government. So welcome. Hope you enjoy your time here.
Here. Madam Deputy President, another query many people may have when considering the need for transparency of ministerial diaries is whether we risk duplicating other areas of lobbying regulation reform. And I recognise that's a valid point for consideration. However, I would point to the other interstate jurisdictions that I've previously discussed, the ACT, New South Wales and Queensland. All of these have stronger and tighter lobbyist declarations and register regulations in place than Tasmania does, while also having mandated ministerial diary disclosure requirements. Clearly, those jurisdictions see ministerial diary disclosure as complementary to and part of their holistic lobbyist regulation regimes, rather than duplicating or competing with those other requirements. And as noted by the Tasmanian Integrity Commission during its recent public consultation process on reforming Tasmania's lobbying regulatory system, the regular and timely public disclosure of ministerial diaries can provide an important cross-referencing mechanism. The Integrity Commission's Overview of Submissions report, which was published in October last year, states the following, and I quote, "Public officers disclosing diaries was widely supported in submissions received, other than in the whole of government response. Reasons given for the benefits of disclosing diaries were the ability of the public and the Commission to cross-check. This matching exercise, though resource intensive, serves an auditing purpose that the Crime and Corruption Commission of Queensland undertakes to encourage the idea of mutual obligations between lobbyists and the lobbied." And Madam Deputy President, to ensure I don't inadvertently misrepresent the Integrity Commission's position on this, I do note that although the Commission provides in principle support to publishing ministerial diaries as a, I quote, matter of good practice for government transparency, it also identifies limitations, with some established examples of ministerial diary disclosure schemes, such as too narrow a scope by just focusing on ministers rather than including other public representatives. Hence, the motion recommends that in developing a Tasmanian ministerial diary disclosure regime, investigations of those implemented in other jurisdictions be undertaken so we can identify their strengths and weaknesses to inform the development of a viable, robust and enforceable scheme here. Further, as also pointed out by the Integrity Commission, it's beyond the Commission's jurisdiction to require ministerial diary disclosure. It's not within their power. It would be up to the government and the broader Parliament to progress this recognised important transparency mechanism as part of our modern and robust integrity apparatus. So to reiterate, Madam Deputy President, making this proposal in the motion today is not about any accusation of current or previous governments of any particular wrongdoing, nor is it about imposing any predetermined prescriptive model for mandated ministerial diary disclosures, but it is about forging an inclusive plan by which to modernise and make more robust our integrity framework. By doing so, we will be investing in both strengthening our accountability apparatus as well as the Tasmanian community's trust and confidence in our democratic system of governance. And importantly, this proposed reform would complement other current integrity reforms, including the lobbyist regulation in Tasmania and political donations disclosures that's on its way through this place. Ultimately, getting the ball rolling in an inclusive and collaborative manner on this particular proposed integrity reform will benefit all Tasmanians. Without doubt, the routine and timely release of ministerial diaries can help protect decision makers, as well as those participating in legitimate advocacy in any contest of ideas on policy and funding decisions in our democratic system. Not everyone can get a foot in the ministerial door on matters that interest or affect them, and not everyone wants to have a foot in that door. However, raising the blinds on who is in the ministerial room when policy, funding and other matters are being discussed can ameliorate community concerns of undue influence being wielded by some vested interests during those discussions or over public representatives. At the very least, as highlighted by Dr Belinda Edwards' reference to the demonstrably positive impact gender participation reporting has had on inclusivity, routine diary disclosures may encourage public representatives to more actively seek out as broad a range as possible of perspectives and experiences to provide input into government decision-making processes. So, Madam Deputy President, I thank members for their consideration of this motion, and I look forward to hearing others' contributions on this proposed important transparency idea. To close, I wish to refer to a report published last year by the Queensland Crime and Corruption Commission. The report was Influence and Transparency in Queensland's Public Sector, and in it, the Crime and Corruption Commission states this: the public expects government decisions to be made in the best interests of the community, and that their state and local governments will be open to ideas and advocacy that enhance the quality of those decisions. For all views to be properly considered, access to decision makers must be equitable and transparent. This will give the public confidence that no improper influence has affected the outcome and will reduce the potential risk of corruption. That's what this motion is about, Madam Deputy President, getting the ball rolling on providing the Tasmanian public with that confidence that no improper influence has affected the outcome of government decisions and that they are and will continue to be made instead in the best interests of the community. It's nothing more and nothing less. But I commend the motion to the House.
Question is the motion be agreed to. Those that opinion say the honourable member for Elwick.